Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety podcast, where every week we have guests on and we explore the ways that we can rapidly progress the practice of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. This week we're going to be talking about how health and safety and HR can work together for better outcomes. Today we've got a very special guest, Wade Needham. He's General Manager, Environment, Health and Safety at Fresh Country Farms of Australia. So thank you, Wade, so much for coming along.
Lovely to be here, Jace. Thank you.
Now, you'll notice conspicuously I'm all on my own. Unfortunately, Joelle couldn't be with us today. Wade had to duck out for when we were planning on recording this, and fortunately we were able to reschedule, but Joelle couldn't make it. But we'll have a hopefully good conversation and plenty of things to share with the audience.
Sounds good.
All right, great. Well, what I thought we might do as a gentle introduction is to maybe discuss what are some of our favourite podcasts. Joelle and I wanted to talk about that a little bit last podcast, but it went over an hour, so we thought, hey, we'll maybe start to talk about that in some of the other pods that we do. So maybe I'll turn over to you, Wade. You know, what are some of the things that you like listening to?
So I'm actually going to be a little bit disruptive here and say that I don't listen to any podcasts anymore, but when I say that, I do read transcripts. So what I have found is around, whilst podcasting, is quite great for some people. I'm a reader. I love reading. I like using, and imagining how that comes forward. And often some of the stuff around podcasting, just doesn't resonate with me listening to people. So to me, that's more important around, it doesn't really matter what format you get the content and you sort of see that. So, but acknowledging that you do lose a bit of the interplay, obviously, if you can't see or hear people. From a podcast perspective, I'm really big fans of Farnham Street. I love their work. I love anything that sits there and talks about mental models and sort of challenges me on how I pull information together and stimulus, and then pull that into some form of model that then I can act upon in the world and create impact. So I'm really a big fan of that. Tim Ferriss was an early favourite. Obviously, Andrew's Tap Into Safety podcast. Safety on Tap, podcast. I've been on that a couple of times. And I love listening to different people. And also there's a couple of other, Todd Conklin's is great. Disaster Cast is good with Drew Ray and those sort of guys. So, Andrew Proven puts out some good stuff as well. So, I mean, there's an absolute plethora of information out there that you can go and grab. And I think that's the important part because, if you want to learn and you want to rapidly get better and get quicker, the only way to do that is both consume content and then use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got to say, I'm always a little bit embarrassed when people say, what book are you reading or what are some of your favourite books? And I actually don't consume too much knowledge through reading myself. I think I got burnt out doing my master's and I was like, if I read another journal article, I'm going to...
And that's it, and that's the beauty of sort of the world we live in is you choose your medium, you choose who's providing the advice, and then you choose whether to take it on board. So I think the sort of hyper customization you can have these days really puts the onus back on the individual as to go out and find it and go and get it, and then consume it in the method that most suits you. I think there's heaps out there, and I'm happy today to sort of add to some of the information out there.
Yeah, well, hopefully people will start mentioning the Psych Health and Safety podcast when they start mentioning some of the other ones. I personally like, definitely The Safety of Work by Drew Ray again and David Proven, something that I like listening to when I'm swimming laps. I also like Laurie Santos's The Happiness Lab, which is a great way of looking at wellbeing and some of the science around how do we make people happier and reach a peak level of flourishing. And then Malcolm Gladwell, Revisionist History is fantastic. And then the other one I was thinking of is How I Built This with Guy Raz. It speaks to a lot of startup founders, which is really inspirational given that we've got a startup ourselves. And Business Wars, where you hear about some of the big business battles, I guess, like Blockbuster versus Netflix. And I won't spoil how that one finishes, but it's really great hearing and then dissecting, I guess, how these companies either were successful or some of the mistakes they made and what made them not successful. Yeah. Well, great. Well, tell us a bit then about yourself, Wade. I know you get around the conferences quite a bit around Australia and internationally, and you do get asked to speak on podcasts and other events from time to time. So a lot of people know you already, but we do have a broader audience than just health and safety. There will be HR practitioners, psychologists, and so forth on this listenership as well. So tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah. So I suppose from my side is I got lost. So I went to university out of high school and then did 3 years of financial and managerial accounting. Realised through the end of that in discussions with a partner from Deloitte that that wasn't the life that I wanted to live.
Yep.
So I made a choice very quickly and early on that maybe wellbeing was important and the importance of people cultural fit. So did sort of shift into HR business management for my last year, got the bit of paper, realised I couldn't tie a tie to save myself and ran away to the construction industry for the next 3 years and helped worked in civil construction. So I learned to build and be part of subdivisions, evaporation ponds, port, rail, and all those sort of large sort of pieces of infrastructure in very lovely places like the northwest of Australia, down south at Ravensthorpe. So very fly in, fly out. So got very exposed at quite a young age to working in normally an older cohort, but being very far away for long periods of time from friends and family. And then halfway through one of those projects, I realised I was quite literate and understood what health and safety and HR was, and got thrown the JHA, and that was my job for the next sort of 6 months, is write the JHA out every 3 days at this mine I was at. So whilst 90 people sat around waiting for me to write the JHA. And then toddled off and got some postgrad quals, and then went in earnest into health and safety with a civil provider. Went through the major miners and worked in and built some quite large resource construction projects, the mine, port and rail. And then jumped over this side of the country to help out and build some of the tunnel infrastructure over in Sydney. And then from there jumped into government services, defence, healthcare, citizen services, and after that, now I find myself in the agricultural sector.
Yeah, amazing. So it's really great because we see psych health and safety as something that's applicable to all industries, right? It's not just one particular industry like physical health and safety. And it's great that you've got that broad range of experience and across so many different sectors, and now a new one again.
Correct, and I think it's the interesting side of the subject matter we're talking about today is you both experience it yourself, but you're also then looking to either enable it or to prevent it as well in a professional capacity. So that's one of the really interesting things for me that creates a bit of a dichotomy, is that you have to live and breathe it both yourself, but also you are just as much at risk as to other people, even though you maybe you chosen field that you're operating within a business about.
Yeah. Now, many people would know you as head of health and safety for Serco APAC, but you're in a new role now. So can you tell us a little bit about, what are some of the fun things that you're learning in your new role and a new industry?
Yeah, so I'm in the agricultural sector now, and so I'm looking at both farm gate activities and then post-farm gate activities. So I'm working with various leaders in different agricultural verticals associated with improving their maturity, associated with how they manage health and safety. Very different maturity, very different incident rates and frequencies and severity. So most people would know that there's the severity rate and the frequency rates associated with both workers' compensation claims and incidents in the agricultural industry is one of the highest in Australia, if not the highest. So definitely a very different cultural mindset, but also very different market dynamics as well. So hasn't had typically the larger corporate sector, such as the mining industry or the regulatory input and factors associated with construction and that union involvement. So whilst it is still high risk, it's just had different sort of factors that affect it. And typically a lot of people still think of farming as a sort of mum and pop operations rather than as businesses and organisations. And I think a lot of the commentary is sort of focusing on that now, that whilst farms are a place where people live and work and enjoy themselves and raise children and live very fulfilling lives, they're also workplaces as well. And so I think there is additional focus now being placed on sort of how do we both mature the industry, but also acknowledging that it is still a unique type of occupation. And we don't want to lose that unique cultural aspect as to why people live, work and operate on farms.
Yeah, terrific. And sounds like you're doing something that you love and love of learning, I guess. You're learning new stuff every day and challenging yourself.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's right. And my mum's side was wheat and sheep farmers from WA, in Narrabeen. So I've sort of got a foot in that camp. So I would definitely say that I'm a concrete cowboy, pretend, so to speak. So I'm definitely not a ringer or anything like that. But you like to pretend and gull yourself. But yeah, like you're exactly right. It is great applying knowledge that has worked in other industries and continually testing yourself in new industries, but also with different leaders as well. Different abilities, different challenges, and often in agriculture, it's very low spans of control. So, not very, very low distance from CEO down to actual employee, whereas in often a lot of the other contexts I've worked in, there's multiple levels of management.
Yeah, terrific. Now, the podcast obviously is more around psychological health and safety for employee mental health. And I first met you actually at a workplace mental health conference that happened in Sydney just as COVID was starting to hit. And you were up there talking about some of the initiatives that you had done in your previous role. So yep. Would there be anything that you could share from some of those things?
Yeah, and look, I suppose I'm a bit... Yeah, I think everyone attacks this area very differently, and I think you'd always attack it from what you've learned in the past or what you've experienced, be that either a lived experience, either through like yourself through study and then through application and then through the use of tools, and then or you've got people who have gone through it and come out the other side and have something to share, tell, and to help people. So I think everyone sort of comes at it differently, and sort of I suppose to sort of outline my the way that I come at psychological health and safety is really probably from a position, from an occupational hygiene position, which is probably a little bit different to other people, whereas I sort of treat it like load and exposure, and really demand an ability to cope. Versus I think a lot of people come at it more from maybe focusing on the individual and sort of being either bringing it or then having the resources to fend it off. And so I think whilst at Serco there was very different risk profiles because we had corrections associated with a risk profile, and then you had healthcare, which security within sort of emergency rooms and departments, and then you had mental health patients with mental health illness that you were dealing with as well. So I think the other thing is the common thread that ran through them all for me is that always dealing with them and acknowledging that this was a risk like any other, be it health, safety, environment, political, business interruption. It is another form of risk, and so you have to take that lens, but you also have to acknowledge that it is largely very subjective. People are different, and people are individual, and so then the ability then to influence that and to do innovation really then comes from how do you get people on board to either improve and promote sort of the thriving side and sort of perform and potential, or then the other side is really how do you then prevent harm to people. And then at worst, you may have people, who have very different backgrounds and who may be very diverse, and also you may be required to be inclusive of people who have certain conditions in the workplace, and then you're really looking at how then do you mitigate. So to me, I was trying to balance a lot of the things between the three of those. And so, whilst, we looked at really partnering with our employee assistance provider, we were also looking at things like how do we look at job dictionaries or job task analysis, and rather than taking the safety view of the world and having a qualitative assessment with residual and inherent risk, we looked at, what was the load being placed upon people, and really challenging ourselves to really have criterion and sort of being able to articulate to people what were they facing in their job. But also not just saying to people what are the bad parts of the role, but actually then looking at those and using those assessments to actually inform our hiring practices, and talking to people who were excelling and thriving in those roles as they were crafted. What is the type of person that likes this role? What makes that person good? What makes that person want to come back and get out of bed? So I think for a lot of it, while some things might be seen as innovative for some, often a lot of the time we looked at embedded processes and making them better, and largely that was just helping leaders be informed of the risk profile that came with that load, and giving some words and sort of qualitative processes and toolkits for them to use.
Yeah, fantastic. I really like how you're using that integrated model and not just focusing on the mitigate illness, where a lot of organisations seem to spend probably 90% of their time when it comes to employee mental health, and then combining that, prevention of harm and promotion of flourishing. I've also come across another. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Wade.
No, it's always tough, and you always start with, you look like even the safety side, we blame people in human error. We always start there. It seems to be that's the first rung of the maturity. It's only when either we've got nowhere else to turn, or when the business community rounds on that position and realizes that, hold on, no, it is the conditions we're putting people in and the way we craft our jobs. So I think there is still probably a little bit of a run to play with, fitness fruit bowls and flu shots, and notwithstanding any of that importance of those things, but they're always going to be a complement, and they're just if we only focus upon them, we're only band-aiding the symptom.
Yeah, absolutely. And all those things, like you say, are important. And if you think about your hierarchy of controls, they probably do fit in there. Maybe they meet the equivalent of a PPE in the hierarchy, which health and safety professionals will know would be the most or least effective control in order to address existing hazards. So
the only challenge I have with calling it PPE is very much that I know if I put a class 5 bit of hearing protection in my ear, it will protect me to class 5. Mm-hmm. But also that, and being the only factor that the variable that, I need to install it correctly, basically in my ear. The worry I have with treating things like EAP or things that mitigate harm is that both you don't take away the actual hazard, and B, sometimes we assume that they work and are effective. And so they might work for some people, but often we're not typically relying upon a consistent factor that can present then a reliable outcome. Yep. And so whilst not degrading any of those three things, that is the challenge I have, is that when you're sort of advocating for these things, it's often a case for you need to try it and see if it works. But for some people, EAP doesn't work, or, they may be, vulnerable people who can't have flu shots, and so you end up with this really hard one-size-fits-all blanket when actually, even the best of PPE, you need a fit test. And I think that's the other thing that as we personalise the employee experience, we're going to get better at doing.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would contend even that EAP wouldn't even fall under the hierarchy of controls if we're making those equivalents. It would be more like your injury management. If someone's had a muscle strain or broken a bone at work or something like that, then they need to go away, they need to have physio, they need to maybe have surgery, that sort of thing, and then return them back to work. So EAP is about helping people who are already distressed where the controls have failed and they've developed some sort of, even if it's not time off work, it still is, workplace stress-related conditions.
Yeah, and that's it. And look, a simple thing people can do is, that most EAPs will have manager assist lines, and there is often the catch call that, you ring up, speak to someone from EAP before it becomes a problem. Often we don't identify risk factors as risk factors until they actually cause us harm. We have to touch the hot plate. But that's one thing people can do, is that, often, and not speaking for all, load that becomes placed upon people, but that relationship that individuals have with their manager is absolutely crucial. Absolutely. And so that if where managers can reach out and either receive coaching or have a second perspective associated with how the delivery of a certain messages, workload or news to somebody could affect them, and then how that could be received, I think those things are a great use of EAP, and I think also a nuanced approach of how we get people to do these things can improve as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this also kind of ties in with the traditional hierarchy of controls versus the CDC total worker health hierarchy of controls, which I think is far more applicable to workplace mental health. So the bottom rung, instead of PPE, it's actually promoting self-care or encouraging self-care. Yes. So that's where your fitness, flu shots and fruit bowls fits in. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's often the challenge with quite traditional leaders. We'll hold on mental health, something you bring to the workplace. We just exacerbate it. Well, that's the I'm not tough enough argument. And I fully acknowledge that life will, cause people heartache and curveballs. And I was talking to a colleague who recently, a loved one committed suicide. Of course, that's going to knock you around. You bring that to work. You can't separate it. But also at the same time is that while individuals are employees and they work for us, I guess it depends on how you look at it. That person will be going through and will lower their productivity for a certain period of time, and that is ultimately a very reasonable thing to do. And really, it's contingent upon an employer looking at the upside, acknowledging that if we get great productivity and great outcomes out of people, unfortunately, human performance is variable. We need to acknowledge it, and whilst we can do as much as we can to sort of not lower the dips. Major milestones are going to occur in people's lives. You can't prevent divorce. You can't prevent parents passing away. So I think there is this real shift acknowledging now that, these things occur. Yes, you can't prevent them. Yes, we will support you. No, we can't take accountability. But also what is good for you is good for us. And I think that's where the additional investment and awareness and drive is coming from.
Yeah, I really hope in the not too distant future that we have a lot of people treating those outside influences on employee stress and well-being the same way they do with physical health. If someone's trying to take care of their physical health by going out and playing an active sport like footy or basketball, or they're going to the gym and they have an injury, well, the company is going to support them, understanding that there's certain things that they can't do at work because they're injured, or that it's going to exacerbate the injury, even though it didn't occur in the workplace. And like you say, it's not compensable, it's not the workplace's fault. But we support those individuals, understanding, hey, if we support them, they're going to be loyal. They're going to continue to, increase what they can do over time.
Yeah, and that's that acknowledging that risk includes opportunity. And so it sort of, takes me back to a bit of an age-old argument used to have in mining and construction in FIFO that, often people would be playing sport after hours, and normally, someone may have a couple of beers while they're playing indoor cricket or whatever, and an injury would happen. And then is it work-related? Is it compensable? All these lovely things go down. And ultimately, yes, it is compensable. Yes, it is work-related. However, if you stop those social and physical activities or try and restrict people's behaviour, it will have a byproduct. So I think that's the other thing which quite nicely leads on to that. If one enabling function such as either safety, HR, or any of them act in isolation, unfortunately then they create byproducts which then either will reduce well-being, but either they will also increase turnover, lower engagement, and ultimately not have and not improve your workplace culture and not enable you to achieve the outcomes you want in your business.
Yeah, totally agree. As you mentioned, that is a good segue. So we should probably start talking a bit more about today's topic, which is how can HR and HSE become more aligned and work together in this. So you've got some pretty unique experiences, I guess, and I'd be really interested in your observations about how you've seen, I guess, the roles kind of divided and where there maybe have been compartmentalization of activities.
Yeah, and I think acknowledging that the first thing that I suppose moving forward is that employee experience is not just a buzzword. People and labour are scarce. People are the source of productivity, output, and impact in your business, and ultimately. We do need to acknowledge that the business structures that are currently in place are largely based upon businesses imposing that structure based upon people's qualifications and or experience, when really a lot of the time we're now shifting our business models to how do we serve our customers better, customer is king, all those types of things, and how do we deliver upon needs that maybe they don't even know, whereas we are starting to see that more and more in the employee space. So I think that there will always be a place for diverse qualifications to be within a business. But also I think we need to challenge ourselves as professionals to stop thinking in functions and start thinking in how do we serve our employees. And when I say serve, that doesn't mean doing exactly what they want, but that means working with them to enable them in a manner in which is beneficial for both business and for them as individuals. So I think that's the first thing to acknowledge, and then the second thing is around whilst both functions deal with people, they come from very different places and very different typically learning as well. So you would find that there would probably be more HR university educated individuals, whereas safety is still predominantly a lot of people come from, sort of shop floor upwards. And I know that is turning, but ultimately language use, legislation focus, those types of things. Whereas in the IR/ER space is quite natural for legislative focus to be in place. Whereas if you're in talent or organisational development, legislation plays a very little focus. So ultimately, as well, I think you need to both acknowledge the differences of where people come from, the language they use, and both appreciate that from a strengths-based perspective, both individuals' functions and sub-functions within those functions are going to bring something to the table. And that's how you get people to work in nicely. And by nicely, I mean for the benefit of our employees, which ultimately is what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I often see myself, there is a divide, and I've got to say traditionally, I guess, health and safety hasn't had too much to do with employee wellbeing unless something goes wrong, and then they get involved in injury management and return to work.
Yep.
So I see, and we'll talk more about some of the skills that health and safety can bring, but I find often with the HR approach, it is a wellness approach. And if it's a wellness approach, that means that it's a voluntary thing. So if we're going to run an initiative like a lunch and learn, or we're going to do a fitness activity or something like that and call it a mental health promotion activity, we'll get people to put up their hand and say, hey, look, who would like to be involved? We think it's really great. Hopefully as many of you will get involved as possible. And then they're surprised when 20 or 30% of people actually put up their hand and do it. And it's the same people every single time who are putting up their hand, right? And these are the people who are already engaged. They're thinking about self-care, obviously. Many of them are probably going to the gym or being active already, or maybe they've got a Headspace or a Calm already downloaded on their mobile phone. So they're already engaged. And we're not really getting to the people who we really need to get to, which are the people who are so busy they can't attend the lunch and learn that has a guest presenter.
Yeah, that's right. And sort of this is where I sort of come back to the occupational hygiene approach. And they have this concept when you're doing risk assessments in occupational hygiene called similar exposure groups. And so what you do is you group people or individuals, and that may be in a location or a role that have similar exposures. And so then you can take that one step further, and then you can sort of start creating personas or sort of, sort of stereotypes of people. And that helps you focus upon that the hazard is not consistent and is not weighted the same for every single person, which is why we don't put, people that are investment managers through working a heights course, but also acknowledging that, we may make some things mandatory for roles that have higher levels of load placed upon them, and that's okay. But that runs counter to this equality thing of trying to get flexibility for everyone, trying to pay for everything. So I think also that's where one of the real strengths that the health and safety resources can bring to the table is this ability to very easy to articulate that risk and load, is both acknowledging the consequence and then the likelihood, and then the ability over time for that load to be placed upon somebody. And then secondly, does that person have the capabilities to then withstand that? And that's that question which talent then comes into it, is that, of course, somebody who has a higher level of experience and skill and has been in a job longer is going to be able to take a higher load because of they can do things faster, they process, they take less effort to do things, while somebody starting out will second guess themselves, not know the shortcuts, have more attacks of imposter syndrome, all those types of things. So unfortunately, a lot of this hazards, whilst we know them, often the subjective part is the individual, and we're a bit loath to call out sometimes that some people are better at handling load than others, because of obviously at the moment equality is something that a lot of businesses are pushing for, but unfortunately it may create unequal outcomes, like you said, only offering courses to people who are already engaged and are already getting the benefit for it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing that stuck out earlier was you're talking about treating workplace stress as an occupational hazard, and you can apply occupational hygiene principles to that. And I agree. If we look at, if you're talking about the exposure groups like you were just talking about, then we look at places like, say, education, financial services, banking. These people, like you say, they're not at risk of falling off the top of a roof. They're not going to, lift a heavy box. That is probably the biggest risk from a physical perspective, maybe a manual handling risk. So maybe that's a bad example.
Yeah.
But they're going to be exposed to workplace stress. But even though that's probably the biggest risk to these individuals becoming ill or harmed at work, we're not actually treating that occupational hazard as something that is a mandatory training requirement. At the very least, if we talk about the very bottom, an administrative control for this hazard would be, let's train everyone, or let's give everyone access to resources that are going to help them to take care of themselves.
Yeah. And I think that also stems from, if we tie that back into a talent perspective, typically, most people, when they first got promoted into a management role, may have been in a casual job or may have been, in their first or second job. It was because they were good at their job. You then, looked around and you just got the higher pay grade. Did you get additional training with it? And often it was sink or swim. You're good at your job, therefore you will be promoted and then you'll be great at management. That happens all the time. We don't see that as, we don't see as training managers so that they're ready to take the next step as a health and safety risk mitigation.
Yeah.
These are those concepts that blur across the functional lines, but ultimately, by getting our people into a position where they can comfortably make the transition to a higher role, where they may be looking after people or they may be taking on additional responsibilities, workload, time zones, whatever it is, we're helping them adjust. And then that will have benefits for both them, making sure that they both can do the role and are at a higher success rate of continuing the role, but also then the flow-on effects of those individuals, because the people they manage, there'll be less micromanagement, there'll be less focusing and trying, not trying to protect their own patch, or there's less time that the individual above them that's managing them needs to spend with them. So I think at the other time is around merely doing, and so the way I look at this is around, well, if we wanted to mandate and make sure that our people were ready for the next role, does it have to be called a health and safety control? Could it not be working with talent just to make sure and to improve the rate or the internal promotion rate or the stickiness rate of internal promotions as to how long that they're, time to competence? Those metrics and other metrics are one, and often we try and chase our own metric when actually helping another function will have a byproduct for us. And that's when I often see people don't have they don't understand the input activity sort of outcome impact sort of model.
Yeah, that's a really great observation, and I think it's going to be really beneficial for the listeners to have health and safety professionals and HR professionals and psychologists all coming in, and we can understand where we're using maybe the same term to explain different phenomena that we're observing.
Yeah, and look, there was one organisation I worked with that used to set out that if you were to lead a team, you could only have a certain amount of individuals under that leader. And this was a major minor. And so the contracts we issued had to sign on that supervisors could only have so many people. They had to do 4 units of competence. Now, these were to an AQTF level. Those types of things, whilst that was quite rigid in their application, that was their risk threshold. So they, as a major minor, said, we acknowledge that poor supervision or low supervision or lack of supervision contributes to fatal events. Been proven, WA Mining did a great review between, I think, 2010, 2017, a great many amount of deaths occurred when the individual of leader or supervisor was less than a year in the job, and it had even less experience on site. And so you can't take that, you can't stop people getting promoted or stop getting new jobs, but it's around how you enable it and how you plan and how you onboard and those types of things. So, but when trying to take that somewhere else, another major minor acknowledged that it was a great idea, yet the commercial boundaries between, they didn't want to be seen to be, saying to a contractor that you need to do this, because they were afraid, should they take that next step and say to people, you must do this, even though it was categorically, clearly the right thing to do based upon, some of the research, they were worried about taking on that liability. And so I think that's also important to acknowledge is that while prescription can sometimes be very good, we have to be conscious that first principles are important, and making sure first principles are embedded into the context of which we're operating is the most critical thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also ties in with the importance of senior leadership and board level support for these initiatives. And yeah, I believe you've got some commentary around how health and safety and HR can work together about trying to get it on the agenda and, get the time, budget, resources available to do the activities that we need to do.
Yeah, and often, if you've got two voices, your voice becomes louder. And then when you're an exec and two different people are coming to you with, and they've written something together that meets both of their outcomes, your brain automatically jumps to, well, hold on, I'm paying X and I'm getting double benefit. So I think then that, shows that both A, it is important, B, that you understand finite resources in a business and that you're not, obviously asking for something just because it's topical, and also that, you've got commitment from others in your business that they'll work with you on getting these outcomes. So I think that's really critical, that if you are going to try and push something to a board and exec level, the ability to maximise your chances of getting something both on the agenda and approved and then funded, only the more amount of voices you have will obviously improve those rates. I think the other thing is that you can, most people probably don't appreciate, is that boards have to set risk appetites for the business. They set which markets they can enter, how much capital they need to deploy per year, or return on investment. A very similar process has to occur for non-financial risk. We do it often a lot, and you hear it. Most companies have golden rules, or they have certain rules that you have to follow. That is the board setting a risk tolerance that if you do a task, you will have this in place. If you step outside, bad things will happen for you. Unless that it's a systemic issue, and hopefully the business has a just culture process that doesn't just admonish the worker, actually looks at why the conditions cause the event. But I think that's really important to acknowledge, the fact that you need to help call out non-financial risks to your board and get them to understand that their current either lack of determination as to where does the risk tolerance line sit can cause grey, and then that may help them or sort of not help them when it comes down to proving due diligence. And I think that sort of model where those principles of due diligence could really be leveraged by HR to get that resourcing to improve those levels of learning, but also for things like lowering span of control, increasing spend on either coaching or leadership activities, or even just down to getting that people data. Just sort of don't just do a one thing pulse survey. And stop asking people, questions of, are you happy? Start asking them questions about, how does your manager support you? Start asking them questions like, do you feel like you've got no one to go to? All of those indicators that are actually more representative of people's both longer term state, but also asking and seeking that information around those things that employers can control, which is resources, work direction, and job design.
Yeah. And I find there's still a lot of board education that health and safety and HR can do as well, because they're not always going to be aware of the key risks. I can tell you, for instance, I was on an independent school board for 6 years here in Western Australia, and just before I came off early last year, we had a couple of people who looked at the risk register, and to bring it up to spec, they basically went to a large company, government organisation, looked at their risk register and basically adapted it for the school environment. It was interesting though, because under operational risk, they had all the usual working at height, manual handling, confined spaces for a school whose largest population of employees is school teachers. And then when it came to stress, they had lumped student stress and employee stress together. And the mitigation was, we've got a chaplaincy service, or if things get really bad, they can go see a psychologist through our employee assistance program. And so fortunately, I was still on the board at that point in time and could recommend, hey, look, if we have a look at some of the codes of practice, the DEMA's information here in WA, they actually have some really good guidance about psychosocial hazards, and we know that in a school environment that workplace stress is one of the key hazards that we need to really understand and manage. So we really need to beef that up and put something in our operational risks or in that area.
Yeah, and I think also one thing that people struggle when they are sort of communicating with boards is they need to understand what is material to the board, what is the board's role, and the board's role is to both identify and set risk tolerance for the executive team, but also they have a very limited area in which they play in, and so you need to acknowledge that. How do you communicate that what you're talking about is a material risk? And often, if you're talking in a very big business, potentially a fatality, whilst may have some horrible impact to both a family, a workplace, and those may not be as material as what people think. However, if you start talking about something like Dreamworld and the reputational damage and the lack of revenue that generated, that may likely get, that is the avenue in which to take. So you have to sort of be a little bit, don't take a knife to a gunfight. You know what I mean? Jesus, understand the other person's perspective and the world you're entering, and you need to educate yourself so that you can effectively translate what fundamentally and are passionate advocate of into a language that gets the outcome and impact you want. And often that is probably the key missing link between people having a huge amount of passion and lived experience and wanting to do something, but being unable to find either the words that communicates that, or keep banging their head against, well, why aren't they listening to me? Why aren't I getting things approved? And why don't they take it seriously? And they sort of place it down to bad leadership. But oftentimes it's a failure of a meeting of the mind, so to speak.
Absolutely. We need to understand what boards are responsible for and what's going to get their attention. I know, we are going to have Dr. Rebecca Michalak on at some point. She's got some really good case studies of when things like even sexual harassment, which can be considered a psychosocial hazard, when those things happen, what can actually happen to your market capitalisation as a very large organisation if that isn't managed well.
Correct. Yeah, and that's the impact you need to look at. And so, non-financial risk being reputation can be quantified in stock price, but also social license to play. So that's why you do find, a lot more organisations now have a lot more stringent accountabilities placed upon execs around, dating and having relationships within the company. Representative of, they will act if they believe that share price or revenue could be affected. And they're very quick to do these things. So I think, and notwithstanding the fact that this is a sole issue that people need to upskill their knowledge of what board does to get, it's a two-way street. People need to come down and listen as well. But also, often the board can't make managerial decisions. They can recommend, they can promote, and they can do, but also, a managerial team has certain responsibilities as well. And so, it's sort of it's a bit of a dance where we all need to understand where we're playing. But what I would also acknowledge is that markets, be them either stock exchanges or sources of capital, so investment houses that typically are elevating their either capital requirements. So if you want capital, you have to meet ESG standards, for example, or insurers are not insuring some products. That is a very effective way to change the workplace. Doesn't have to be legislation. So another source is AGMs. Shareholders are very vocal and do want lifting of standards. UN sustainable goals. Those are external impacts that we in health and safety and environment would look at. Our standards like 14,001 and sort of 45,000. And our impacts and aspects and our stakeholder concerns and those sort of things. That is how we bring it forward. That is how we use our strengths. And then we partner with, our HR and our other functions like compliance and risk to present a united front into the board to show this is how we can help you mitigate this risk or prevent it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does fall under CSR a bit, as you say. And I remember reading an article where Bill Johnson, one of our ministers over here, was quoted talking about WA joining the Commonwealth WHS Act and the expected changes in the next year with a greater emphasis on psychological health and safety. And he basically said this just reflects what society expects these days of our leaders and our organisations, that we care about the mental health and we have practices in place that don't put the onus on the individual, but thinking about how the role of employers plays on wellbeing outcomes.
Yeah, and we need to acknowledge that the public health system is finite. We have an amazing public health service in Australia, but also for those employees who may find themselves on the end of abuse from their managers, not just poor managers, but abuse or sexual assault or illegal categories of action that people undertake. They do end up in the public health system and it costs taxpayers. So I think the other thing is acknowledging the limitations of the workers' compensation system, the stigma that's still attached with submitting a comp claim. And the way in that scheme is managed. So I think there's a social good there that does, and as people become more literate into understanding, that we all have mental health, it's both positive and not so positive, and then all of the good work that's been done around Are You OK and those sort of things has an impact, and our elected representatives will change if we ask them, and so I think broadly the macro trends point all towards this factor, being a lot more material to business moving forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that is one of the macro trends is insurance, right? And a lot of people are finding it hard to get compensable recognition for mental illnesses or workplace stress claims, and so they just go to TPD. And from what I understand, TPD is on the verge of collapse because of all these mental health claims, rather than them going through work cover or workers' insurance. So again, Dr. Rebecca will talk a little bit about that one when she comes on.
Yeah, and I think that's acknowledging that there was some great cross-sector work that was being done, I think, by Monash, under Comcare and some partners associated with the different schemes, even down from absenteeism right the way down through, and the different schemes that could be entered that provide either medical or economic benefits associated when someone is ill or unable to work. And each scheme can be entered at various times. They can interact with each other, but also there's different tests, and it's quite complex. It's not easy. So scheme design and scheme use and spending time in the scheme, and in public health or private health with treats is always a factor. But I think always does come back to, you're looking at the cost versus when there is obviously a mandate, and it's very easy to appeal to an organisation who is there to make a return on investment. That hold on doing this not only prevents you from incurring costs, being insurance, absenteeism and such, but also then generates higher levels of engagement, higher levels of creativity, higher levels of profitability, higher levels of all of these things. So these are more and more being able to quantify. So I think like safety in design is always better than a PPE down the other side. So these are lessons and principles we can apply, and I think the thing that I'd love to see more of, and more health and safety and HR professionals entering and discussing, is sort of when we're able to then adjust, workplace design, either in the environment or in the job role side of things. And that means entering conversations in tender conversations if you're a service business, or, entering conversations associated with mergers and acquisitions, or through, how we're going to do restructures and those sort of things. And often to get to those seats at the table, there needs to be a really strong understanding upon financial impacts. And so then understanding what you're asking for and what that means. And if you're a 2 to 6% company, you're going to have less chance of changing workplace design than if you work for Atlassian. But also at the same time doesn't mean the principles are wrong. And so often people lack that understanding of that systemic nature of business, and how moving small little wheels at certain locations can have quite a big impact to the person on the other end. So someone in purchasing changing, looking at something and going, well, why are we ordering 10, kilo bags of cement? We can order them 20 and they're, 10% cheaper. That one stroke of the pen creates a double load down the chain. So I think as we can, supply chain visibility becomes stronger and more visible, the same will happen to business decisions and how they affect our employees and our clients and customers.
Yeah, interestingly, you mentioned that, because in ISO 45003 in the draft, it actually talks about procurement and having to understand that, because that can also cause workplace stress.
Very much so. And I think that we know the factors that affect that. And I think whilst they may become detailed, and it's going to be, and often it's seen as another level of bureaucracy, for it not to be seen as another level of bureaucracy, we need to understand the principles and embed it in the processes that are already in place. And so I think if you do chat and you partner with functions such as procurement, and they can understand that if you change something that makes it easier for them, or that they think they're doing the right thing, if they then, who may be very well reporting to a CFO, the impact of doing this causes this. And so, if you are then talking to a finance person, then potentially they then are an ally to convince the procurement person that, hold on, I acknowledge that you can have a couple of dollar win here, but that's going to have a multi-dollar impact to our insurance down here. And so, you have to enable people to both partner, but also see the shadow of their actions, not just immediate, but into the future.
Yeah, I'd be interested in your perspective while we're talking a bit about procurement as well, because one of the hurdles that we often have to jump, being that we are a technology startup, is that when we go to large organizations, there is a requirement that we have an information security management system that is certified to 27001, which is the gold standard for information security. So we actually had to go through the process of looking at all our hardware, software, procedure, policies, and everything to make sure that we were compliant and get certified to that standard. I'm guessing, I haven't seen it myself, but you'd be able to tell me whether people have to, some procurement requires organisations to have a OC health safety management system compliant with 45001. Yeah, if you're contracting or
so
subcontracting.
Yeah, so it tends to be the more mature industries have those. So obviously, if you're entering into contracts with either major miners or constructors and those sorts of things, typically they may have to carry certain certifications. So whilst mining doesn't have to be required to have certification, they often design the management systems too. And so often then you find supplier pre-qualification processes and audit processes, is all around how do they reduce risks both to, their own operations, but also to the people within their supply chain. So, federally, if your projects are above a certain level, you have to be accredited to the Office of Federal Safety. But often, as much as certification and designing and having systems doesn't always mean that you get a good performance and a good outcome. And so often, paper safe sort of outcomes can occur. We have processes in place and they make us feel safe and they make us feel like we're covering our ass from a due diligence perspective and a legal perspective, but they're actually not having any impact. So, Greg Smith, who's a WA boy as well, fantastic book he wrote, Paper Safe. He's a great one to talk to. The fact that if you have paper, it is both a sword and a shield. So it is a sword that a prosecutor can use against you if you said that you'll do something and you don't. But for a well constructed system and process, it needs to acknowledge the fact that unfortunately counting injuries, whilst it is still important for certain processes, you actually need to validate that your risk management system is working and your incident management system is working, so that when you actually are identifying risks, what is the test that you yourself can validate that it reduces risk to so far as reasonably practicable, and then how are those controls that you put in place sustainable and effective, and how do you ensure that? So I think also this will turn as more prosecutions do come out associated with greater levels of regulatory activity against directors. I think there will be a lot more of upskilling in what due diligence is, a lot more asked of health and safety people and HR people to validate and outline what is in place to prevent these. And then secondly, it's going to have to pass the pub test. EAP is no longer good enough. The bad apple theory is no longer good enough. Oh yeah, there was a group of bad apples. No, the barrel is the bloody problem. You need to acknowledge it. And as directors and officers and of senior execs, the barrel is your responsibility of creating.
I love the agricultural example. Well, nice tie-in. I guess I dream of a future, right? If companies, large, we're talking about multinationals and government organisations, large government organisations. If you want to work with these people and provide services to these people, if you have to have an OC health and safety management system and show that, it meets a certain standard. I guess my dream is when things like the code of practices come out and we have ISO 45003, that at some stage they'll be like, how are you looking after your people? And EAP won't cut it. We need to see how you're identifying and managing risk. Where's your mental wellbeing action plans for the next 3 to 6 months?
Yeah, and look, I think the challenge with any form of standards, it's implementing another barrier of entry into the market. And so it needs to be balanced around the impact that such a standard will have. For example, a lot of large corporations with very high standards find that their contracting pool is quite tiny because they have such high levels. So, one of my roles with a major miner was to assist smaller subcontractors meet and pass the subcontractor pre-qualification process. Now, often that was not about, here's a form, take my logo off, put your logo on. It was actually around helping them understand the principles of what they were trying to do. And often in the processes that they had, be them informal, often a lot of the time, you didn't have to overcomplicate things, but it took, unfortunately, a high degree of understanding to get back to first principles, and then working with that business owner to enable them then to tender for those contracts. And often this happens in trying to increase Indigenous organisational within the supply chain. So, often companies will say, well, look, we want to put a certain amount of local spend into contracts, or we may want a certain amount of spend with, local Aboriginal organisations that are owned. But then the system gets gamed, and then you have sometimes silent partners who are not operating, and so they, it looks and smells and feels on paper, but it's not having the outcome it is, which is increasing, Indigenous engagement and Indigenous, employment. So, a very long way in saying that, unfortunately, while systems and standards are fantastic and they help us validate, ultimately we don't want to lose that those systems are really codifying the principles that we should be looking to embed in our business to both reduce the risk, which is both consequence and opportunity of realizing the objectives of our business. And so ultimately it does come back to risk management.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, interested to see how it all plays out over the coming years. I think there's a long way to go, obviously. And on that, I guess we're talking about how HR and HSE can work together. I know we've gone on a couple of little tangents here, but I think, leadership support, understanding how boards make decisions, understanding what drives organisational decision making is very important. But I guess, does there need to be change in how health and safety work together with HR? Or, and if it does, I guess, if it doesn't, I guess it's a very simple answer. No, it's great. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. But if change is required, what are some things that you think we could do that would lead to that change?
I think the big one is to acknowledge for health and safety professionals is that often HR are your upstream. I find that often if you think at the very back of workers' comp, that's injury and sort of, mitigating illness. I think as you sort of work upwards from the curve, then there's the prevention of harm, and then you've got, how do you make people thrive? I think the same continuum exists in HR, IR and ER. And so I think the thing to acknowledge is the fact that we're not in competition. We're actually, able to both work together, and the positive byproducts when it works is good. So to give you an example of where greater collaboration and connection can be made is, for example, in the areas of pre-employment medicals. The aim of pre-employment medicals is to assist and understand and generate a health baseline so that we do not put an individual into a role that their medical condition precludes them from being able to undertake safely. That can be abused and could be used as a screen to lower diversity of the applicant pool, but also at the same time, that can also assist HR in generating a quality pool of applicants that are able to stay in the job and thrive in the job. And so and the reason of how you build a very good pre-employment medical screening process is by working with occupational medicine provider to actually outline, here is the risk profile of the business and the role that these people are going into, and then working with them as to then help screen and establish that baseline, so that those people who are successful and go through the process are able to use and leverage that medical for personal reasons, as in to get healthier, or they may wish to go and visit their GP if it flags something. But also, let's say if they're below the line that we set, they may still be able to succeed and thrive in the role, but we may need to adjust the role. And so this process is not a 1 and 0 approach. That is a very good example where both safety, which may be trying to prevent all injury from a zero harm perspective, needs to trade off to say that, hold on, no, we want a more diverse and inclusive business. Therefore, we need to accept more risk into our business, and therefore we will need to modify our roles and our workplaces to accept that. So those are the connections there that I think really work well to sort of deepen, but also acknowledge that it's not a patch process. And another example is where let's take workplace bullying, for example. Often when we're doing an investigation of workplace bullying, it is around, does it meet the legal definition in a fair work HR context? We don't acknowledge that often there is a different test for workers' compensation, subjective test, that is very different. And often if the formal legal HR investigation acknowledges that there was no bullying, which may well be the case by that definition, that person may have suffered harm and may have an illness. And so then putting that person back into that environment and back under that load, which clearly they've been medically, diagnosed as being unable to take, that's just negligence. We're putting someone back into harm. Now, I acknowledge that, people may not want to believe that, but, it also, if we only treat bullying and harassment as a single isolated event, we miss those individuals who also may be, perpetuating this on a systemic level, or whether there may be a cultural issue within the business that then deems it acceptable, and maybe you've seen the tip of the iceberg. So I think that to me, whilst I think a lot more can be done, I think the connection needs to be deeper, but also I think there needs to be a bit of a suspension of patch, and also a suspension of I own this area, and a suspension of I can only add value to the business through my way. And often you will find that, where people aren't confident, or there may be less data to support as to why and how they're adding value, that's where those, that fear and patch protection comes in.
Yeah, those are two really great examples. And hopefully, as we talk to other professionals in the field, then we start to really uncover this, because it's obviously key. Health and safety and HR do need to play together. It's not just HR's role, it's not HSE's role, it's actually everyone's role. But both have, as you say, very particular strengths and understandings of specific issues. So if they can join those strengths together, then we're hopefully going to make a more dramatic impact on the outcome, which is improving employee wellbeing.
Exactly, and this doesn't mean that individuals who do commit acts of bullying and harassment, are write-offs and they need to exit the business. We need to follow a just culture process, that then affords both the ability for the victim to also be acknowledged, but also the individual to also grow and be able to, improve, because I'm sorry, the person I was at 18 versus the person I am now is very different. And this comes back to, often it's the individual is put into a role, is promoted into a role, is selected by the company to enter their business and work in their business. And so oftentimes, no different in well-being, but oftentimes when it does come into where individuals have not behaved well, that is a factor of their environment that they have been in prior. And so it is contingent upon the employer who brings them into the business that they need to assess that they're going to contribute no harm to others in the environment, because that is their duty as a PCBU under the legislation. And so whilst not giving a free pass to everyone who does behaviour that is sometimes absolutely abhorrent, and is vindictive and is premeditated. There are genuine individuals who are put into situations which a promotion is very attractive. They take on more responsibility, and sometimes individuals are set up to fail. And so that outburst and that person micromanaging you may just be out of their depth, and they're not getting the support they need. So often we only see the sort of the field worker as sort of where risk comes from. But I think that's the other thing psychological health and safety is helping us with, is that this is right through our organisation, and it's not just the tip of the spear, the people serving our customers or moving things around. This is just as likely to hit a CEO or a board director or a non-executive, as much as somebody who's going through a divorce, in field.
Yeah, and as you point out there as well, when you look at issues like bullying, harassment and sexual harassment, that is not the only hazard necessarily. Like you say, it could be a range of hazards: organisational culture, leadership behaviours, recruitment processes. All of these things are different hazards, and we need to understand it's the combined impact that is going to lead to the negative outcome, not just the single issue around bullying and harassment.
Yeah, because we're not trying to get people sacked. We're also not trying to be perfect, but you have to create the environment that enables people to thrive. So throwing a party, and not providing water or soft drink or light drinks, food, and providing heavy amounts of copious alcohol with a on tap bar for a Christmas party is probably not a good environment. Yet we often wouldn't do a risk assessment or treat that as a health and safety issue. So that's the sort of things we need to start thinking into account. And the other one is around, we have a huge amount of technology available to us, and we're conversing through email, text messages, video chats, and all those sort of things. And more will this I think trust-based economy come forward. And so we're going to have to get used to people screening our emails for keywords. People will be, well, why are you as a manager calling your direct report at 10:30 at night? This is a sort of data that we can pull right now through platforms that we currently use, yet we're not leveraging it for good. And so I think that's the other pressure that will be placed upon businesses, is around acknowledging that both we can do more, but there will oftentimes be a trade-off in the fact that we haven't done this prior, and not many people will like the fact of their emails being trawled, even though in their employment contracts it clearly states they can. So I think, and that does often erode trust in between businesses and individuals. But often this is where ethics comes into it, associated with health, safety, and well-being. There is always a trade-off, and that's the hard part of what we deal with. And that's where society steps in and goes when the trade-offs too high. For example, what we're seeing now associated with mental health. And so that's the other thing I think is around the political activism that both we undertake in a business and change, but also separately as our role as citizens and through our voting rights is really important.
Yeah, it's got to pass the pub test, as you say, but I guess there's still so much to be done. We're clearly not at that level where we're dealing with psychological health and safety at a systemic level. It's still, again, more focused on the individual, more reactive. We need to get more preventative. Yep. And clearly HR and health and safety have various skills that they can bring to the table, and hopefully we continue to find ways to work together and combine the approaches, because we're obviously stronger combining those strengths as compared to working in compartments.
Correct, and that is what our executive leaders want to see. They are accountable for all the whole array of metrics associated with all of our functions, but ultimately the key metrics associated with operating in the capital market is social license to operate and return on investment, and by managing this risk better, preventing, mitigating, and then creating conditions for thrive, we'll do that. And so I think, if you are in this role or you're in the professional, maybe even if you're just entering, I think it's an exciting time to be in the role. But also it's very contingent upon yourself to go and be educated in these different fields, so that you do find when you are given a voice, you're either able to speak from a position of evidence, and when you're advocating for certain positions, or both acknowledge when potentially you may not have sufficient evidence or understanding and you need to put your hand up and bring others in. And so I think that's the other key thing, is if you don't feel like, if you don't feel like you have all the answers, you're in very good company, because I think everyone is sort of working this through. And ultimately, the only way we do get better collectively as an industry and as a country is acknowledging that and improving. So, it is a process, it is a learning journey, but, in saying that, we can very much accelerate the curve, considering we've done similar for physical safety, and for other forms of health that we can, bring into organisations.
Mate, you should be hosting this show. I think that was a very good way to probably sum up, I guess, what we were talking about today. Look, your time is very valuable, and I'm really glad and appreciate the time that you gave us today to express some of your expert opinions, and obviously very experienced, and that really came forward in what you presented today. So thank you so much. No
worries. Thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to the next episodes.
Yeah, great. Hopefully you'll be tuning in. And remember, everyone, you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, all the usuals. Also, just remember we videotape this. So if you want to see Wade's burgeoning goatee, then make sure you get onto YouTube and check it out. We'll be sharing some clips as well on our own LinkedIn profiles. So feel free to follow myself, Joel Mitchell, Wade Needham, or connect with us. We're friendly people. And also you can follow the Flourish DX LinkedIn page as well for regular updates on psychological health and safety and the podcast. So that's it for the week. Thanks again, Wade, and thanks to the audience for tuning in.
Beautiful. Thanks.